So Paris Lees, who's an activist and journalist that we heard together speak last week, said this about your book. I've never been so excited about a book. Thank God somebody finally wrote it. Blistering, absolutely vital, writing from one of the most exciting voices in British politics. A stunning, important debut. Fellow white people, it's our responsibility to read this book. This book is essential reading for anyone, even remotely interested in living in a fairer, kinder, and more equal world. I'm so excited to have you here to talk about this book. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
Yeah, I'm genuinely so excited to be having this conversation, so thank you. So since Our Shed Shelf chose your book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, as our selection in January, it has since become a bestseller. Your debut book has won the 2018 Jalak Prize, the British Book Award, and the Bread and Roses Award. You've also started a podcast called About Race that continues the conversation. You've clearly been incredibly busy.
It's been a very overwhelming year and a bit, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
How are you feeling, coping?
Well, you know, the book is full of things I wanted to say for such a long time that when it came to publication day in June 2017, I literally thought that's the end of a chapter. I was like, well, that's that done. Oh, it's
finished.
Yeah, exactly. And then I was like, I'll just go back to my life. But the world was like, no. So I've just sort of spent the last year sort of like trying to accept what was happening first and foremost, and then being like, okay, well, what can I do with this? And so it's been interesting. The podcast is really fun to make. I'm excited about the conversations that the book is provoking, and now I feel, you know, a year on, I can sort of step back and be like, wow, I'm proud of what's happening, and I'm like really happy to have like contributed a small part of this like larger conversation.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, got to embrace that. That train left the station and you had to be on it. So.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But for like the first few months, I was like, what is happening? Where is this going?
Yeah, I bet. So coming back to your original blog post, one of the reasons you mentioned that you stopped talking to white people about race was because so many people would get defensive and dismissive and were not even slightly willing to see their own privilege. To me, your initial reaction had a powerful dose of rightful anger and also self-care in it. I'm no longer putting up with this. If you insist on twisting my message or continue to be in deep denial about historical or current context with regards to what's happening around race, then why should I engage? Because the consequences for a person of colour can be really negative. Did I get that right?
You got it spot on. Because, you know, when I wrote that original blog post back it was February 2014, and I remember my life circumstances then. I was for some reason sleeping on a mattress because my landlord had not organised a bed, and like everything seemed bleak. And I was also very much involved in activism at the time. And let me just say that I wrote that blog post not for want of trying. That came from a good few months of attempting to provoke a conversation about race and racism in my progressive activist circles. And so that blog post was like saying, I can't do this anymore, and here are the reasons why. I don't really believe in ghosting, you know, like some people, when a situation becomes unbearable, they just disappear. I can't do that. I always have to sort of give an explanation as to why I'm leaving this space, and so that's what I did with that blog post. And I suppose like the job of a writer is to try and like grab to these like what feels sometimes quite intangible emotions. And I was really trying to articulate like what it felt to be sometimes, it felt like locked in a battle of me trying to say racism exists in these progressive circles, and people in those progressive circles saying, this is all in your head, you're being divisive, etc., etc. So I wrote that blog post. I didn't mention any names. I didn't talk about any particular situations. I just said, this is what it feels to be like this, to be in this situation. I can't do it anymore because it's really hurting my mental health. I press publish. I expect nobody to read it. Like, I'd been writing on that website, on my blog, since I was 19 years old, and nobody really read anything that I had to say. But when I clicked publish on this, it just took on a life of its own. And so many people from all around the world are saying, mood, you know, this is me, I truly resonate with this. Do you know what I mean? And my mind was blown. And also, there was lots of white people who were reading it who would be like, wow, I did not realise that I had been like unwittingly taking part in this. And even now, you know, for work, I travel a lot to different parts of the globe, and I still meet people who are like, oh yeah, I definitely remember reading that back in 2014. So, you know, the power of the internet, largely a force for good in that particular circumstance, not always.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just absolutely, you know, blew my mind.
Yeah, I can't imagine. It really picked up some speed. It had crazy momentum.
Yeah, definitely.
So the book kind of feels like it was written as a guide, methodically making your case for people who deny that white supremacy and their own complicity in a racist system exists. You kind of start with irrefutable facts, the brutal history of racism that still is being erased, denied, defended, propped up in our hallowed institutions of knowledge like Oxford and Cambridge. You show how the structural racism is built into our systems and then just like continues to fester. You show how white privilege is insidiously kind of ever present. You tackle so much. You kind of white fears, white feminism, and class divisions. You covered so many different topics within this area. But is there anything else since you published the book, since you've been part of these conversations, that you wish you had written about or covered, or like I wish I'd put in a paragraph about that?
I'm going to say that that book was a real encapsulation of a lot of my thoughts over the span of a good 7 years. And I don't think there's anything that I didn't cover that I wasn't thinking then. But now I'm really interested in how these things affect our mental health in particular.
Oh, wow.
Because I think that racism really negatively affects your mental health if you are subject to it in a terrifying way. And I think that that's something that we're not speaking openly about.
Yeah.
Probably because, you know, anti-racist movements are, you know, built on this idea of strength and defiance and resistance. And it can be scary sometimes to pipe up and be like, you know what, this is really chipping away at me.
Yeah.
And when I think about that initial blog post that I wrote, it was speaking about the micro and the macro. I was talking about dynamics of society, and I was talking specifically about how that was affecting me and my mental health in particular, because there were times when I was involved in those activist sort of conversations that it literally felt like an onslaught. It felt like I couldn't, you know, open my technology or go to a gathering or a meeting without preparing for some kind of nightmarish battle conversation about whether or not racism exists, you know. And that was having a hugely detrimental effect on my mental health, for sure. But that wasn't something that I was thinking about while I was writing the book. It's only now that I've had some distance that I can be like, you know, that is truly part of the conversation. And I also, you know, now that I have the, you know, huge luck of meeting readers of all races, I have people come to me and basically tell me that they thought they were literally going mad until they read the book or until they read that initial essay. You know, I've had people at signings come to me and cry and say, you know, thank you for validating what I was thinking here. And I'm in an exceedingly fortunate position to, at least like my job is now, everybody knows what my opinions are, like that's part of my job. And I just like feel I'm cut up by people who are in circumstances where that's not the case, but they are still attempting to talk to white denial about race in friendship groups or workplaces and just being made to feel like they're the crazy one, you know?
Yeah, they're insane, yeah.
So I think that's something that's a key part of the conversation, but that's something that I've only come to the conclusion, you know, some months later.
That's so interesting. And like, I mean, just thinking about how many conversations you've had to have since the release of the book and even just writing it and everything you've dealt with, like what, have you found any tools that you find help with the constant sort of stress of that? What's given you, what do you use that gives you kind of resilience to deal with it?
I can't tell you that I've been resilient, Emma.
Yeah.
I think for the first few months, like, you know, I said at the beginning of this interview that I was a bit like, and that's because, you know, if you are writing or, you know, engaging in some expression about anti-racism or some injustice in the world, if you come to public prominence for those ideas like I have, so you are seen a little bit like a symbol, and that's scary, you know. Yep. That's true. I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
And you know, people often talk about the hate that you can receive as a symbol, but I would also say the reverence is equally as scary.
Frightening.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I started to be like looked at as somebody who'd have answers, and I was like, I don't really know. I just know how bad this is, and like I can use my skills as a journalist to attempt to expose that, and as a writer to attempt to like speak to the emotions of it. But I can't tell you how to live your life or how to move forward.
And suddenly you're like this prophet where everyone's like, so okay, great, you've written this, now give us the answers.
Exactly.
And you're like,
exactly. And I suppose like how I had to like over the last year, how I've built resilience to deal with that is to retreat from the sphere somewhat, and sort of like get in touch with who I am as a human being, rather than a symbol of any particular like, you know, anti-racist discussion. And that's been a learning curve for me for sure. I never felt an obligation to do that, but I was certainly inundated with requests to do so, and I just said no to everything, basically, because you know, one thing that I always say about the book is that the book is like a collection of my very considered thoughts and thinking and research and conclusions over the best part of a decade. They're my really considered opinions based on fact. But not all of my opinions are considered, not by any means, you know. And so I prefer to keep the ill-informed, like, opinions to myself, you know. And I'll talk about that with my friends and family. But it's amazing how I'm called upon to speak on this or that. And I'm like, honestly, I don't believe it's imposter syndrome to say, I don't know about that. And that's something that I'm really like, I'm latching onto this idea of I don't know. Here's what I do know. Here's what I don't know, and just because I know about this doesn't mean that I know about that, and I'm not going to pretend to for the sake of pomposity. That's been a learning curve for me. I don't think I did it at the beginning, but I certainly felt pressure to. And that's been amazing for like a sense of self and a sense of grounding and resilience to hopefully go off and do some more thinking and writing about things.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear you say that, and I found the same thing where it's just like, it's not even pomposity, but it's just like there's just an expectation that you will speak to and speak on things you don't necessarily know about, and actually it's really hard to say no or to not meet people's expectations or be as vocal as people would like you to be, and yeah, that's been a huge part of my self-care and survival as well. So
yeah,
it's
definitely.
Really interesting to hear you say
and
that.
I think that like I call it pomposity because I do feel that there are some people who they take that opportunity, and you know. One day you're like, wow, I really enjoy their considered opinions on this, and then like, you always see them in the news, and you're like, hang on, wait a second, this is becoming a little divorced from reality, you know. It's a careful like line to walk, and I'm sure that you've experienced it as well. But I kind of decided that I wanted to say, if I was going to say anything in the public, it was going to be considered and thoughtful, and that way I wouldn't dig myself into a hole.
Yeah, no, 1000%. I cannot relate more. Yeah, amazing. You want to feel like you've got something to say and you've thought about it, and like it's an active thing as opposed to it coming from this weird place of
like
external.
Riding a wave.
Yeah, totally. The book has had a positive response from white people who seem willing to address the way that they benefit from white supremacy. I also loved it in the feminism question chapter, when you said that white women must question their whiteness just like we question patriarchy. That was such an important line for me, because I definitely had not allocated anywhere near as much time to that question as I had allocated to questioning the patriarchy. From your interviews regarding previous activism with white feminists, I get that hasn't always been the case, that they haven't kind of done that work as well. And so can you talk more about that?
Yeah, definitely.
Experience?
I think it's quite interesting because like your like piece that you wrote on Our Shared Shelf to sort of intro the book to the book club was really interesting, your self-reflection on that. And then I felt like there was this conversation happening where it's like, right, well, the conversation's over, like Emma Watson has spoken, and like, like racism and feminism is over now. And
wow.
That was the vibe that I was getting from some people, for sure.
Wow. And you're like, I think that's going to solve it overnight, everyone.
Well, I think that's because like you're considered a feminist leader, so it's like people are like, okay, well, Emma said that, so okay, we're cool with it now, right?
Everyone cool? We're cool? Good.
But,
and how did that, like...
well, I was just a bit
how
like...
that makes me feel, but how does that make you feel?
Well, I feel like reading a book is an intensely personal experience, so you're speaking for yourself.
Yeah.
You were speaking for yourself in that.
Yeah, well, I
piece.
went through this like deeply personal, painful like journey with it, and you kind of have to go through that process of like, had loads of difficult conversations. I went into loads of reading, like that. Me getting to the point of writing that was like, it was a process. Like it was one of those things where I was like, no, hang on a minute. I've been talking about intersectionality and I've been talking about how important that word is, but there's something about like practical application of it and like a deep, like personal experience understanding of something. And it's just different. It's a different connection.
For sure, definitely.
You know, books can take you some of the way, and it's really important to do your own work like that and not expect everyone else to do the labor of explaining things to you. But at the same time, it's those one-on-one moments I've had with people that really changed something for me. So
for sure, like, and I think that like the book primes you to feel open to those conversations,
Yeah.
right? So in the book, the first chapter that I wrote was chapter 5, which is a chapter about feminism.
Really, that was your first chapter?
That was the first chapter I wrote.
That's so interesting, because as I was reading it, that was the chapter I was like, oh my, like this is really,
It took me like a year to write. It took me such a long time.
12 months.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's because, well, it was kind of like difficult to recount some of the stuff that had happened. I had to speak about, it's the only chapter in which I spoke at some length of my own personal experience of talking about race and feminism. And my own personal experience was pretty hairy, to be honest. Like it wasn't a fun time.
Yeah.
And the story is that I started getting involved in feminist activism when I was like 19 years old. I was an English literature undergraduate. I'd read The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, and I was like, oh, I'm really resonating with this stuff. So I went on Google and I just searched, UK feminism. And I found this blog called The F Word. I think it's still going. And they aggregate like events and stuff. So I was like, I'm going to go to some of these events. I seem to be the only person in my immediate vicinity who is thinking like this. So I'm going to go to some of these events. And I met some incredible people, some people, much older than me, some people my age, and it was an amazing, supportive time. And as the years went on and people started to pay a little bit more attention to the conversation about feminism, the movement broadened and there were more perspectives, of which mine was one, more diverse perspectives, as people like to say. And there were conversations about, race and disability and sexuality that were also happening in that big broad feminist movement, and some of those weren't welcome. Let's just say some of them weren't welcome. So I found myself in this sort of deadlock because I was writing and blogging on the internet at the same time. Anyway, so I got invited to go and speak on a national radio program about feminism in that particular year, and I was the only black person on the panel, everybody else was white. The issue of intersectionality comes up. I'm asked to discuss what it is, which is essentially, the crisscross of different discriminations, could be sexuality and disability, but the concept came from the legal scholar, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. I'm asked to describe this, so I do, and then one of the white women on the panel said, yes, this is all very important, but I think we also need to talk about the fact that some people are using this concept to bully me online. So then Mike goes to me. So Reni, do you want to talk about that bullying? And it was just totally devastating. I was 24 years old. I was at the beginning of the career, the beginning of my life. And my work in politics were somehow being equated with sort of bullying. Now, don't get me wrong, that woman apologized soon after. There was an online, drama about it. An ex-Conservative MP weighed in and said, Reni is the bully. But all of that stuff was just hugely disheartening, right?
Yeah.
And I think scared me away from feminism for a while because there was just a lot of denial and stuff going on. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure that woman had been harassed online from people from across the political spectrum, but there was a sort of strange situation happening afterwards where I was being implicated in that.
Yeah.
And a month later, I wrote that blog post why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, you know. It was pretty devastating, but there's a narrative out there about what it means to be a black and feminist, and it's been equated with being an angry black woman, and so I'm going to try really hard to prove that narrative wrong and put forward a different perspective and contextualize it in terms of, what it means to live in this world as somebody who isn't white when we have global superpowers that have sometimes overtly and sometimes inadvertently, like advance the idea that to be white is to be right. And so that's what I really tried to do with the book. Although back then I didn't know that it was going to end up being the book. I was just quite like hell-bent on trying to provide a different narrative to the one that existed then.
Yeah. I think our educational systems really prop up that feeling and that sense of accomplishment. Like certainly when I went through school and then went to university and I did my time at Oxford, and like you sort of get given this certificate of like, well done, now you know everything. You've like ticked all the boxes and you've gone and done what we've asked you to do, and now you can go off into the world and like
know things.
You know things.
Yeah.
And that actually really sets people up for I think like quite a sort of devastating come down, and not being in the most productive place you can be in life, which is to remain curious, open, and as you were talking about earlier, be like, this is what I know. And part of knowing what you know is also actually having an understanding of how little you know, because that's when that starts to really hit home. But I think certainly, the beginning of my feminist journey, it was like, oh, I was told in school that this problem had been solved, and that's not true. And I think, again, the same thing for race, and like reading your book was like, oh my God, I was really taught in school that this was a problem that had been addressed. And, and then you sort of realize it has not. And I talked about this last week at a conference, at the Nova Foundation conference, but just that this whole like, this phrase that politicians have been coining, which is like being a voice for the voiceless, and how problematic that is, because it's just that, okay, because a set of opinions or information isn't in the mainstream does not mean that people haven't been shouting about it and talking about it a lot.
With that sort of question of education, I think that like, one thing I sort of realised very quickly when I was being involved in feminist activism is that a lot of the white women around me were saying, well, this isn't an issue, why are you bringing it up? This is divisive, because they had gone through the same British education system that I had gone through, that sort of said, this isn't an issue. And like, I only knew it wasn't because anecdotally, like if you grow up not white in Britain, people are going to be like, just watch out for this. And by the way, there was this back in the 80s, and there was this and there was that, and just like, it's almost like an informal, like supplementary education that you get, right? And if your family or like your social circle has never been affected by that, then why are you going to know?
Yeah, I think there was another narrative that I really held on to really tightly, which was like, in America, they have this really big issue with race, and actually in the UK, our issue is more to do with class, or I can't even remember what I would say, but I like, in my mind, I sort of compartmentalized it like that. That was another narrative that I had come across and had kind of taken on as being the truth.
For sure.
And I think that American politics and British politics are really different and often more polarized, so perhaps, plays a larger role within the media and within the international space, but I think that we have exactly the same problems.
Absolutely. I mean, it was the transatlantic slave trade, it wasn't the US slave trade, and Britain played a huge role in that. I mean, I really admire the work of people like David Olusoga, who wrote Black and British, that came out a couple of years ago. It's sad though, and I also pulled on the work of a like self-taught historian called Stephen Bourne, who I pulled on his work a lot and read it in the British Library when I was researching the book. But I read this piece from a history teacher in The Independent last year, in which he said, I'm being asked to teach a whitewashed curriculum here. And like, I went through that education system, we all did. This history teacher basically said, the only thing that's given me hope is that my pupils are literally interjecting as I'm teaching, being, but sir, what about this and what about that? And that's a really bad situation.
Yeah, it is. I think recently, for the last year, like one of the most intense feelings I've been having is just a real sense of betrayal for my education, because I was a really dedicated student, and I no one really kind of expected me to be taking my education seriously when I started working so young, and it was something that I really fought really hard for, and I poured so much of myself into it. And then to come through all of that and actually just be like, there are these just gaping holes in my understanding, in my history. And like the first moment of like understanding my, like some of my cognitive dissonance was actually just even going to America and then sitting in I did a history of the modern Middle East class, and then just being taught part of this history about Churchill dropping bombs on certain parts of the Middle East. And I literally looked around, literally turned around to the back of the lecture room to see if anyone else was freaking out in the way that I was, realizing that I was like, hang on, this is just like, there's just like this blank space that, I just never knew anything about. And I was like, wow, I feel really, this enormous sense of betrayal. This should be such a bigger part of the education that we receive.
For sure.
How to treat each other well.
It's kind of like very elective at the moment, you know, like you have to become an adult or perhaps go to university and then take a literal elective module, or become an adult and be interested in these things and then go and buy the books. If you're lucky, you'll find it in a bookshop. Otherwise, you're going to have to go to some like obscure library. But you know, when I was in secondary school and learning about the two world wars, there was this word that came up a lot, jingoistic, which is like this excessive, uncritical patriotism. And that word comes up in my head a lot when I think about how Britain is like reckoning with its history, which is often a kind of like really defensive, uncritical denial. And that's worrying to me. Let's just say that for sure.
Yeah, it is incredibly worrying, and I think, as we talked about before, I think it's going through those institutions and being given this false sense of, that like stamp of like, okay, you know everything now.
Into the world
Off
you go.
You know, and actually that not being the case, and then people don't arrive at things with an openness and a sense of curiosity. They arrive with this incredible sense of defensiveness.
For sure.
Kind of like, well, what do you mean? Like, you know, this is, and then people even go so far as extreme as being like, this is bullying, which is really saddening to see. It must have been, if you kind of went to these feminist, the F word meetings and groups to kind of feel like, oh, these are my people. They're seeing things the way that I see, like, this is my community, this is my tribe. And then to actually realize that, you know, to be spoken to like that, that must have been incredibly, like, painful.
Yeah, I felt
because
very
you already
alone.
feel very isolated, and then to feel isolated from the group that's meant to not make you feel that way, that must have been very painful.
When I was at uni, I was the only feminist on campus, let's just say that. Like, it was isolating. I remember working on the student paper and talking about feminism to the overwhelmingly like male student paper staff. You know, you're all voluntary, everyone's doing it because they like to write. And I always used to get laughed at. And then I remember once going into the office and somebody had stuck up like images of page 3 girls and stuff. And so that was upsetting. Then you sort of like go into this situation where you're like, okay, people get it.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I think IRL, like amongst like actual people in real life, like these environments were so amazing and supportive and incredible. And I also found myself involved in an activist group that was called Black Feminists, which was about, I would say like, now we would say like feminists of colour, to essentially discuss like issues to do with race and gender and feminism. But I would say that the biggest divisions I saw were mostly online, not offline.
Yeah.
Offline, it would happen in situations where like there'd be a large feminist gathering, then it split off into groups, and you know, I discuss this in the book. Somebody on the Black Feminist sign-up sheet wrote, why? Like, why is there a need for this, you know? So it'd be like super passive-aggressive, but online it would be much more aggressive and anger-inducing, you know, people confronting each other here, there, and everywhere. And I definitely felt alone, but I had an activist group full of women of colour feminists to retreat to and to meet, and that really got me through that period, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, you know, there's some people who say, oh, why can't we all be humanists and in favour of the human race rather than feminists? And it's like, well, because there are specific things that happen to people because they are women, because society even views their behaviour as feminine. There's literally structural power attempting to marginalise the feminine out of society, back into the home, back into the kitchen. And like, there are also specific things that a power structure literally sets up to marginalise those who are not white, you know? That's why we need something. It's annoying to have to keep saying.
I know.
But here we are in 2018.
Here we are. But yeah, like feminism is needed as a word because it addresses that there is a problem. And in order to solve a problem, it has to be visible. And without the word feminism, the problem becomes invisible again.
Absolutely.
And then there's nothing you can do. And same same with race, same with...
It's just annoying when feminists can see one argument but not the other.
Yeah.
And then you're just like, wow, this is a real uphill struggle.
It's just like,
In fact, I'd say that the power dynamic is very similar, if not absolutely interlinked. So.
Yeah. Audre Lorde, the failure of academic feminists to recognise difference as a crucial strength is a failure to reach beyond the first patriarchal lesson. In our world, divide and conquer must become define and empower. That quote just blew my brain open, because I think I did have that anxiousness around like, oh my God, well, if we're all going to be in these tiny factions, and if everyone's going to put a word in front of feminism, how are we all going to come together and solve the problem? Like, unity, we need to all be together, my brain went off on that track. And then I read that quote and I was like, wow, actually, that's not where the strength lies at all. It's by understanding our differences, understanding the subtlety and specificity of all of those differences that's going to make us really strong.
For sure.
I loved it.
For sure.
Yeah.
Love Audre Lorde.
So cool. What a babe. I'm going to do another Audre Lorde quote now as well. You end the feminism chapter with a quote: "Your silence will not protect you. Who wins when we don't speak? Not us. Do you have a guideline for when you decide to engage or when to walk away?"
Okay, so I'm asked this a lot, and what I usually say to readers is if somebody is obviously being trolly or playing devil's advocate, which I personally don't believe in, because I think the devil is fine, doesn't need help, certainly doesn't need advocates, he's cool, is like, if you sort of get that vibe from somebody, then just feel free to step away. And there's a kind of baiting that happens, a baiting, which I feel that you can just be like, you know what, no thank you.
Yeah.
But when it comes to actually engaging, so I understand that it can be incredibly hard. I literally had to write a book of 80,000 odd words in order to try and get across what I was trying to say in Facebook paragraphs and conversations at parties, and things like that. So I would always say, if you want to engage, there are ways to do it that don't involve a literal face-to-face conversation to somebody who is committed to denial and literally does not see the inequality in a situation. And that's why films are amazing and books are amazing and culture is amazing. And sometimes people sort of say to me, oh, well, how could you have written this book saying you're not going to talk to white people? Here you are. And I'm like, well, that's part of the process of writing a book. You have to actually go out into the world and discuss it with people. And I love
how they're I'm making such a smart, pointing out such a great point.
I think I've heard, if I had £1 for every time I'd heard that, I'd have a pile of coins on my desk. I wouldn't be a millionaire, but I'd say maybe 50 coins.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's
so,
good. Okay.
But for me, a way to engage in a productive way was to channel my anger and my research and my rage and all of my thoughts about it into an expressive endeavour.
Yeah.
And that's what I always say to readers in particular who are I don't know how to deal with this is so difficult, is channel it into something expressive and productive, whatever that might be for you. And sometimes, particularly when it's a friend, I say, you may need to get new friends. Yeah. Which is a sad thing to say, but it is the case, for sure.
One of the reasons I love the histories chapter of your book so much is that A, there was so much in there that I didn't learn in school, which we've already talked about, and B, it feels like one of the first steps to effectively fighting racism is to just own that history and acknowledge our complicity in it and our structurally racist society. As a nation, Britain has to confront this history. Do you see signs of us moving in that direction at all, of this being taught in schools? Are there any glimmers of hope?
I checked, there's 2 petitions on the petitions.gov.uk website. Both are no longer live because they happened in the last government. So I used to say, oh yeah, there's a petition, sign it, but it's not live. So that's distressing. That is distressing. I think that a situation that's emblematic of where Britain is with this conversation is something that happened to the University of Cambridge Student Union's women's officer at the end of last year. Her name was Lola Olufemi, black girl from North London, found herself studying at Cambridge. That's rare in itself. Yeah. And I think she was one of the people involved in writing a letter to the university saying, hey, for this particular course, let's decolonize the curriculum and consider engaging in the perspectives of non-white authors, particularly, those who have diverse perspectives. Let's include. She didn't say censor, she said let's include. And the nightmare that she endured, mostly from the British press. The Telegraph put a picture of her on the front page, somebody who's just graduated, about to start her life in the world.
And trying to find a job.
Exactly. Saying that she was forcing Cambridge to get rid of white authors. And she then endured a torrent of abuse because, you know, from strange people in the world who saw that headline, and it was a whole hoo-ha about a letter that she'd signed. And I think that's a really good, I mean, it's horrendous what happened to Lola. And personally, I think she should sue the Telegraph. But I think it's a good example of where Britain is with this conversation, which is when somebody tentatively says, hey, let's think about, you know, being a little bit more curious in this institution of higher education. They are absolutely slammed and socially punished. And I think that that's where, I don't know if we've developed past that at the moment. And that's really scary to me because this is higher education where students, you know, particularly with the government's higher education agenda since 2010, it's all been about like students with choice, you know, having choice to, you know, model what they want to learn. But when it comes to race, that's horribly slammed down, you know, and that's really scary to me. So, and I mean, imagine if a politician stood up and said, let's teach colonialism in schools.
Yeah.
I mean, there might be riots, you know, and that's really terrifying to me.
Yeah.
A cultural amnesia is happening at the moment, which is that like, what happened with colonialism is now something that's up for debate. So that's kind of like where we are in Britain. We're going to debate it. Was it good? Was it bad? I think that like last year there was this whole thing going on in like academia Twitter where people were annoyed because there were some arguments being put forward. Actually, colonialism was good, and it's like, and the country tried to move forward from that, and it's like, but at the moment, we're like in this weird like debate place where it's like we're trying to debate whether or not this was good or bad, and it's not nuanced, and it's not healthy, and it
feels really disconnected to me. It feels really like, there's like this lack of connection to the tangibility, the realness of it as a thing. If it's being kind of debated in this really like distant academic way, then there's none of actually the emotional connection to it is gone, and it just seems
we need this understanding to understand our country. We need to understand and understand
who we are as a nation. Who are we?
The director of the Institute of Race Relations, his name was Ambalavana Sivanandan. I think I'm pronouncing that right. A quote that he said, "We are here," meaning people of colour in Britain, "because you were there."
Yeah.
And I think that's the perfect like encapsulation of why we need to have an understanding of what colonialism has meant for Britain, because we still got people walking around in Britain being like, oh, well, if you're brown, you're not British. If you're black, you're not British. And that's just so not true.
Yeah, 100%. You've said previously that reading the work of trans writers online helped you to understand more about trans rights. How has learning about the gender spectrum helped your work talking about racism? For
sure. I mean, I think that one of the things that reading the work of trans writers and trans people who are involved in activism has really taught me is to question the gender binary in the first place. It's actually like wild to me to understand, wow, like I sometimes feel like I couldn't relate to somebody unless I knew their gender. You know, like I recently inherited a pet, and like, I didn't know the pet's gender, and I was like, well, it's she, he, I don't know, and that's ridiculous. A fluffy animal, like it's not actually necessary to like relate to the animal, right? So, but another thing that it's sort of really taught me is how, you know, I'm not somebody who's ever been particularly vocal in the conversation about trans rights. I've just been like a passive supporter. I'm like, yeah cool, I support you. But I realise that like, I'm literally being a well-meaning white liberal in this situation, which is like, well, it's not really my neck on the line. I support them, that's it. You know, like I can luxuriate in a passivity because it's not my neck on the line. When I did in conversation with the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she said when she was, you know, had her feet held to the fire, it was something she said about trans people. She said, I understood what it was like to be the white person in the situation. And I think that like, that's what reading trans work has taught me as well. It's like, I understand what it's like to be a white liberal in a situation where you're like, yeah, like, I support this, and, you know, I want everyone to do well, but I'm not going to do anything. And that's been something I've been truly reassessing since the book's come out and since I've been given like a national voice. Is like, I need to nail my colours to the mast. I need to like be public about condemning the disgusting transphobia that's been happening in the British press.
Yeah.
Because just passively saying, yeah, I kind of support this, and then just not doing anything is just not good enough.
I was so sad to hear what happened at our Pride March in London a couple of weeks ago. That made me really sad.
It was
horrendous.
It was despicable. It was despicable.
Yeah, not okay. Okay, so your book was really eye-opening for many white women. Do you feel that it comes across as irritating or presumptuous to hear well-meaning white women speak on the topic of racism, even if they're genuinely trying to wake up from the dream, as described by Ta-Nehisi Coates? Can you be a credible advocate when you can't actually know firsthand what it feels like to experience racism, and more specifically, when you still benefit from the privilege of your whiteness? Because I think certainly at the beginning for me, some of it was around like, oh, I just don't know well enough to talk on this. Some of it was also just around my like genuine ignorance. But I'm curious, like, how do you feel about that?
Well, I kind of, for me, you know, I talk about whiteness with a capital W as a political ideology, and I feel the book is literally attempting to point to that political ideology, much in the way that feminists understand patriarchy to be a political ideology, right? So, and I think that this is an ideology that we can say, I don't agree with that. I opt out of it. And I think that anyone of any race can opt out of it. That's truly what I believe, because it's totally reductive to be like, well, white people think like this and black people think like that. There's plenty of black people who are literally like paid up members of that ideology, you know? And similarly, there are white anti-racists who are literally distancing themselves from it all the time. So I think when it comes to white people who are interested in anti-racism and want to be advocates, I'm like, fine. But don't go to people who are actually dealing with it, like talk to other white people about it. That would be a great thing to do, you know? Because
so it's more about who you're speaking to,
exactly,
as opposed to what you're,
and where you're trying to make that change. So somebody coming to me who's like read the book and is white and is like, wow, it was a revelation, it was this or that. I'm like, that's cool, but like, as you know, I wrote it.
I'm good, so we don't really need to have this conversation. Go talk to somebody else.
Yeah, where it actually like will have an impact rather than explaining somebody's like experience to them.
Don't preach to the choir.
Exactly.
Go and find someone that isn't part of the choir.
Exactly.
Okay, so a few questions from OSS members. There were some really, really good ones. What is the one thing that you want people to stop asking about when it comes to race?
I think it's going to have to be the question, well, what can I do? Because there's a reason why I'm a writer and not a politician or a cult leader. And the reason is that I wanted to like be able to express and call attention to and name things that weren't being named. And I feel at this point I've probably done a good job of that. But I certainly don't want to be like prescriptive about what people should be doing about it. And I think something that sort of like scares me about how the book is moving around the world is how sometimes my readers are really ready to hand over their agency to me and be like, I find this so awful and terrible. So Reni, what should I do about it? And I'm like, no, that's not what I wanted to happen at all. I wanted you to feel empowered to be like, right, I'm going to actually tackle this and make some change. I need to examine how can I go about doing that. And that scares me, that worries me.
It's a hard one because I often find that actually, I find it quite debilitating realizing that I feel like, oh, other people know a lot more than I know, so I should just defer to them. Or like, I don't, and it can be, and it can be that way, but I guess it's like, I love that phrase, like, forget your perfect offering. Like, you don't have, like, somebody that I was actually at a trans training last week and speaking to a member from that community, and I was just really heartened to hear her say, like, yeah, just forget your perfect offering. You don't have to do it perfectly. Like, people do notice and care about your intentions, and as long as you're, like, open and willing to learn and receive feedback and do your own work, then don't not get involved, not say anything because you're so concerned that you have to do it perfectly.
For sure,
That's a really
absolutely.
helpful comment.
Because I cannot co-sign or like approve, okay, that's the right thing to do. And you are doing that perfectly. And I think that's really weird and dangerous for me to do that. Like, I just want people to feel equipped and empowered.
Yeah.
That's what I want.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that all my readers are not feeling empowered. I think that I've heard some incredible and amazing stories from readers who have told me what they've been doing after reading the book. You know, putting up displays of like authors of colour in, you know, primary schools, or one book's talk, a little boy, he must have been like a teenager, so he wasn't that little. He must have been about 14 or 15, white boy. He came up to me and he was like, so I read your book and I really love maths. And so I realised in my school, I go to a very multicultural school, the like higher the maths set was, the whiter the group was, and that was really disturbing to me. So I sat down and I did the calculations and I worked out what was happening here, and then I presented it to an assembly. And I was like, this is incredible. Like,
That's
this
amazing.
is amazing, you know.
People ask me the same thing about gender equality, like what can I do? I'm like, well, just, and to be honest, I needed to take my own advice. Like, the space you work in, the spaces that you are in, like working with Time's Up and like trying to structurally change some of the problems within my own place of work. But I agree with you. It's like being creative about your own specific context and how you can bring your understanding into what you're already doing.
For sure, and neither you or I can
we can't
assess.
No.
Like, if somebody comes up to us who we don't know, we can't be like, well, what's your job? Like, where do you work? Who do you hang out with? Where do you eat? Like, where do you go to party? Like, so every person is the expert in you know, their spheres of influence. I believe that's the phrase.
I'm going to try and ask a couple of questions from the OSS Instagram. So my mum is a junior school librarian. Can Reni suggest any books around the topics of feminism, race and intersectionality for younger readers?
For sure. I mean, I think that like, first of all, like think about those as themes rather than topics for younger readers, because those themes crop up a lot in books for younger readers, often from authors of colour. So I brought one of my favourites, which is Noughts and Crosses by Mallory Blackman, which is...
Loved this book.
Yes.
I was obsessed with this book.
I haven't read it since I was a child, but I literally like this book, which is essentially like a dystopian, like, future where the racial power dynamic is flipped, is incredible. And I believe it's set in Britain, and Mallory Blackman, like Black British children's author, so talented. And there's a bit in this book that resonated with me when I read it as a child, and it's the description of Callum, who is the white character, who's lower class. He cuts himself and he puts a plaster on, and he notices that the plaster is far deeper than the colour of his skin, and it's sort of used as like emblematic as to like what the norm is in that society. And that really set my head spinning as a child, to think about the plasters that I had in my bathroom cabinet and how they certainly weren't my skin colour. So
yeah, and there's also something really beautiful about the metaphor of like even the wound that you try to heal, even like what you try to put on to heal the wound isn't the right medicine or colour or cover or whatever else. It's really deep. In your book, you discuss how the conviction of Stephen Lawrence's killers was a missed opportunity to have a public conversation of racism and its lingering existence institutionally and structurally. Do you feel like constructive conversations on race have been able to happen in response to current recent events, specifically the royal wedding?
So I think that the royal wedding was really interesting. I personally took a vow of silence around the royal wedding because I was being asked constantly, hey, come and be a pundit. But one thing that I thought to myself was, these conversations about race were happening. I often saw some of my like activist friends on the TV discussing it, and I thought, these people are amazing at talking about current events in general. Like, why are they only being hauled out to discuss race?
Yeah.
One of the things I sort of said was, the way that the British media wanted to discuss it was almost like it was our Obama moment. But the truth is that like, two people met and they fell in love, and I'm happy for them because love is great.
Yes,
and
love
like,
is awesome.
But no one was elected here, and so I thought it was a bit of a red herring to discuss it nationally as though, you know, Britain had elected Meghan Markle. What happened was that she fell in love with Prince Harry, and I'm happy for them. And like, I watched it like everyone else, and I was like, oh, weddings are nice. Like, but it wasn't. It wasn't a like reflection of what society has elected. It almost felt a little bit like a balm after Brexit and all of those things, you know, because then people were like, yay, this is like Britain's multicultural society, and I'm like, that's not actually what's happening here, and I'm happy for them.
Yeah.
I sometimes worry that, you know, the people who commission these sort of discussions are a little on la-la land when it comes to these things. And the truth is that there's still real injustice happening. So maybe put the mic there.
Yeah.
Not saying don't cover the wedding, it's nice. But, like, let's not disproportionately say that this is a balm for
Problem
racism in
solved
the world.
now. Yeah,
Exactly.
problem solved. Okay, I'd like to end by just thanking you. And
Thank you.
for talking to me, answering all these questions. Last question. If you could pick a book for our Shed Shelf readers, what would it be?
Okay, I also brought this book. This is one of my favourite fiction books. This is for you, actually, because I've already got a copy.
Thank you.
I ruined mine in a hot tub.
Great story.
It's August Town by Kai Miller, one of my favourite fiction books I've read probably in the last decade. It's set in Jamaica, and Kai Miller's a Jamaican writer, although he taught in the UK in Manchester for some time. And it's a rich, gorgeously written story about life in this particular area, August Town, and race and gender and religion and structures of power, and the concept of the term Babylon, which essentially, I guess, means like white structural power. It's an amazing book, and
Thank
you
you.
absolutely need to read it.
Okay, amazing. Amazing.
I'm just sitting on my hands waiting for Kai to write another work of fiction.
It's really nice actually to have a piece of fiction to like, sort of balance your non-fiction contribution. So this is really exciting. Thank you. Yay.
Definitely choose it for the book club. For
Okay.
Sure.
Like, get it in there. Okay, I need to speedily read this.
Excellent.
So nice talking to you.
Likewise, Emma, and thank you for
Awesome.
signal boosting my book.
My pleasure.
Thanks.